Now call the honourable member for Riverina.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. In supporting the amendment, I must say there is something palpably wrong with a government which refuses to even consider allowing regional students in certain areas to have access to independent youth allowance. Among those areas is a large portion of my Riverina electorate. That portion includes Wagga Wagga, the largest inland city in New South Wales, as well as the important centres of Adelong, Batlow, Coolaman, Gundagai, Junee, Mangapla and Tumut. University students in those places might not seem important to the government, and certainly not to the Prime Minister, who was Education Minister when changes to youth allowance criteria were unfortunately introduced. But they are important to me, and they mean everything to the hard-working families supporting them. Country students do not deserve to be done over in this way. They know it, their parents know it, I know it, members opposite know it in their hearts. But does the Prime Minister? If I may, Mr Deputy Speaker, I might use the words of a particularly engaging and thought-provoking address which I feel sums up the inequality of the youth allowance debate. It was delivered, rather appropriately, on November 11, 1998, Remembrance Day. Quote, "Not only economists but ordinary people understand that the future of Australia and the future of themselves and their children is tied to educational success. Australia cannot afford to waste talent. But under this government, we are engaging in that shameful and cruel waste. We are denying Australians access to opportunity. In its 1996 budget, this government took $1.8 billion of public support away from our university system. The inevitable result has been a decline in the number of students starting courses at our universities. When the cuts took effect, Victoria tumbled from having the second highest growth rate in commencing enrolments to being the state with the biggest fall, a 4.7% fall in commencing enrolments, a statistic which speaks of misery and lost opportunity. No, it's not a bedtime story, and if you care to listen, perhaps worst of all, under this government, we have returned to a system of privilege rather than merit in our universities, a system of allowing the rich to buy a place while those with better entrance marks but not enough money miss out, a system which was eradicated by the Whitlam government when I was in primary school. Who said these incisive words, Mr Deputy Speaker? Who stood up as the great protector of students' rights to equity in education? Who was it calling for a fair go for our kids? They were the words taken from the inaugural speech to Parliament by the member for Layla. Our current Prime Minister, no less. That's who. The same Prime Minister who now does not want today's university students to receive equity. The same Prime Minister who now does not want today's university students to receive opportunity. The same Prime Minister who now plays politics instead of doing the right thing by our youth. Tomorrow's leaders, our future. But it is not just Riverina students who are missing out. The Prime Minister, in her passionate maiden speech, spoke of the decline in commencing Victorian students. Misery and lost opportunity were the words she used. Well, it is fair and accurate to say great numbers of Victorian students will be facing misery and lost opportunity if Labor, and perhaps moreover the Prime Minister, does not support this amendment. Many of those Victorian students hail from electorates presently held by Labor members. Indeed, a great swathe of rural Victoria is designated inner-regional by this ridiculously discriminatory Dr Connect system used to determine whether students will or will not have access to independent youth allowance. I would be fascinated to know what they think of the fact that their local Labor federal member is denying them youth allowance. I would be fascinated to know what they think of their Prime Minister, for whom it was all right to stand up in 1998 and beat a chest about inequity for Victorian kids, yet who now, by her very stubbornness, refuses to give them a fair go. How mean. How? Now, what did she describe it as? Shameful and cruel. The problem is not that this Prime Minister thought having independent youth allowance be debated in the House of Representatives last week was unconstitutional. Oh no, she feared an embarrassing defeat. She knows it is bad policy. She knows it is hurting students. She knows it is damaging to some of her colleagues who represent Labor electorates. So what did she do? She played politics. She shut down the debate. In doing so, she once again denied many country kids the same opportunity afforded to others. How unfair, how inequitable, how un-Australian. The core of the problem with all of this is that the Prime Minister does not understand and, worse, does not care about regional Australia. If she did, she would have fixed this problem a long time ago. Indeed, if she did, there would not be a problem in the first place. Here are some facts pertaining to regional students. Finding full-time employment in regional areas and small communities is often very difficult. The youth allowance legislation does not take into account seasonal employment sectors such as agriculture and tourism in regional areas, creating further barriers for regional students. Regional students face significantly increased costs associated with relocating for study. Many regional students have no choice but to relocate to study. Evidence has shown that it is the financial barrier of the cost of relocating which prevents regional students from undertaking tertiary study. The cost is between $15,000 and $20,000 per annum. Students who defer tertiary studies longer than 12 months are less likely to attend university. Very few universities accept deferments longer than 12 months, meaning those who have to work a 30-hour week for 18 months over a 2-year period will have to give up their spot and reapply later. A Senate inquiry found 55% of metropolitan students go on to tertiary education, compared to only 33% of students from regional areas. They are telling facts and figures. The message ought not be lost on members opposite. Members who sided with 4 independents to silence this debate last week and put it to another review committee now at least have the chance to ensure that all students who had a gap year in 2010, that is 2009 Year 12 school leavers, and who meet the relevant criteria, qualify for the payment and the bill be appropriated with the necessary funds to pay for this measure. So surely members opposite realise there is an injustice in the system. Surely they will want that wrong made right. The Prime Minister and the Labor government has until now ignored concerns about the financial and emotional burden its changes to the independent youth allowance criteria is having on inter-regional students, their families and communities. Labor's commitment to independents to bring forward a review of youth allowance to report by July 1 this year does not address the problem now. The Coalition's bill sought to do that. Nor does Labor give any firm undertaking to fixing the independent youth allowance issue. The Tertiary Education Minister, Senator Chris Evans' media release states the review will report by July 1 this year and the government will move to implement any new eligibility arrangements from January 1, 2012. Senator Evans said the review will consider appropriate savings which can be made to pay for any extensions in eligibility for youth allowance. Any new arrangements must be offset by savings. This is simply not good enough. It does not measure up to what is required. Even if Labor does make changes after its review, it is too late for those inter-regional students who left school in 2009 and had a gap year in 2010, as they are now still required to work an average 30 hours a week and defer up to 2 years. Had the Coalition's bill passed, they'd now be relieved of this unfair criteria. Last year's school leavers are also left in limbo, wondering what to expect after the review. There are already cracks in Labor's deal with the independents and many unanswered questions. How can regional students and their families trust the government to deliver on this new promise, given its poor track record? This government's new promise should be weighed against the many broken deals, bungled programs and hopeless mismanagement of youth allowance over recent years. This Labor government promised no carbon tax, but now is drafting one. It promised a national takeover of hospitals, but scrapped the idea. It promised a national curriculum to begin in 2011, but it has been delayed until 2013, and the list goes on and on. Now the government promises a review and another delay. More delays and more reviews, but no outcomes for rural young people. The independents who supported Labor represent regional areas directly affected by this issue. Their constituents deserve an explanation on why their independent MPs have sold them out and not voted in favour of the Commonwealth payment made to students to assist them in meeting living and education costs when studying or undertaking training. In early 2010, the Labor government altered the eligibility criteria for independent youth allowance, requiring students from areas identified as inter-regional to work more hours for longer before being considered as independent. Students living in inter-regional areas cannot access independent youth allowance if they do not qualify for Labor's new criteria. The regional zones in which students live are determined by the Australian Standard Geographical Classification map. There are many cases where arbitrary lines on the map mean one student is eligible, yet another in the same town is not. There are ridiculous cases which have been cited in this parliament whereby students from one side of a street get the allowance and those living on the other side of the street do not. Students may come from the same class, in the same school, but be discriminated against based on which side of the line their homes sit. The map is therefore inappropriate and is in fact used by the Health Department. After months of campaigning by the Liberal National Coalition, the Labor government was forced to make changes to its independent youth allowance criteria, which would have unfairly disadvantaged rural and regional youth. These hard-fought changes meant students living in outer regional, remote and very remote areas, as per the ASGC map, would now qualify for the independent rate of youth allowance under the original criteria. Unfortunately, the inner regional zone continued to be excluded. All regional students who have to relocate to attend tertiary education should be treated equally. The Liberal National Coalition sought to move further amendments to include students living in the inner regional zone, but this was defeated by Labor and the Greens. The Nationals' Senator Fiona Nash and the member for Forrest have waged a tireless campaign to have this unfair policy altered. I support them in their endeavours on behalf of thousands of Australian students Labor has disadvantaged. I'll finish with some pertinent quotes which underline everything I've said about this issue and why this amendment is so important. Kayla Edwards, President of the Deakin University Student Association. The Deakin University Student Association condemns the youth allowance work eligibility criteria of 30 hours of work per week for 2 years. Young people living in rural and regional areas have expressed that their ability to obtain this type of stable employment is seriously limited, she said. Many young Australians living in rural and regional Australia are more likely to access seasonal or casual work. For this reason, the Association strongly recommends that the legislation be amended to allow young Australians the ability to spread out the 30 hours per week to reflect the reality of their employment opportunities. Clement Mulcahy, the President of the Catholic Secondary Principals Association of Western Australia. Our prime objection to the change is that it will militate against country and regional students. This is unjust when these already face serious difficulties in their pursuit of higher education. Such students are already at considerable disadvantage when it comes to studying at university in the metropolitan areas, as they must relinquish the security of home and family life to pursue tertiary education. Ultimately, this will mean higher education will only be available for those who are better off financially. The member for Lyne on March 18 last year. So they've picked a health rating which is basically drawing some artificial lines around what is rural, what is remote and using that as a determinant for whether people have to qualify for independence via 15 hours work or 30 hours work a week. While 85% of the changes are positive, more students would have been assisted if this final aspect was not included in the package. Sarah Dickens, a student and witness at the Senate inquiry. There is no way you can work 30 hours a week while at university. I've got a friend who does work 30 hours a week at university, a very bright boy, and he's just scraping passes. He is never involved in any of the social or cultural aspects that are fantastic parts of uni because he is working his job, and when he's not working his job, he's trying to scrape in the study to get those passes. That is not the way we should be doing university, especially in courses like medicine, which has 38 contact hours a week. There is no possible way you can be working 30 hours. And in an age where minimising stress is considered so important, University of Queensland researcher Dr Helen Stallman, regarding a study that found 83.9% of students were mentally stressed and that much of it caused from financial pressure, she said, "Studying full-time and having to work to support yourself puts unrealistic pressure on students, and more needs to be done to ensure their mental health and that they stay in our universities." National Union of Students President Carla Drakeford, NUS is concerned about the number of students who are mentally stressed, which is why we have always advocated for more students to receive youth allowance. And John Brearley, West Australian South West Mental Health Service and Senate inquiry witness. These financial pressures, we understand from mental health, lead to family disharmony, increased levels of mental ill health and depression, pressures on other family members and risks to younger siblings, increases in domestic violence, potential loss of family home or car, family discussions about financial prioritising, feelings of discrimination and, in small communities, the fears of shame, leading on to isolation are real pressures. We are also concerned about the pressures on our young people. There is guilt felt by young people who have concerns of putting financial pressure and burdens on their families. We're having real instances of where young people choose not subjects in Year 11 and 12 that are going to lead them onto university pathways. They are instead looking at pathways that can earn them a quick buck. Finally, the Prime Minister, again speaking at a higher education conference before she landed the top job in March 2008, of course getting our young people to university, TAFE and private institutions is only the start. Once there, we have to ensure they get the best higher education and training possible. The Prime Minister said there would be no carbon tax in the government she leads, but she is now hell-bent on bulldozing that through. Here now is her chance and her government's chance to put fairness back on the table when it comes to independent youth allowance. Thank you, Mr Deputy.